let's start with a very introductory question to get everybody on board. I think everybody has probably heard the word colonialism, but there'll be varying degrees of understanding of what that word is actually referring to and why it is such a big topic.
Right.
Um, so if somebody just came up to you and said, what is colonialism? What would you say to them?
Well, what I would say is that how we would define modern colonialism is the imposition of a new form of government and governmentality
Mm,
on people that didn't ask for it, that involved their way of life, that involved their way of living in terms of the land, and involved land and animals itself. In modern colonialism, we would want to distinguish from, because colonialism has been around a long time, but we would want to distinguish modern colonialism in that it has two elements that we could say are relatively new. One is the heavy involvement of a people called Christian in it,
mm,
and the organizing of a new government, a new form of governmentality inside of a vision born of that Christianity. So modern colonialism has that element, those two elements crucial to it. Form of governmentality that people didn't ask for, and
hmm.
Christianity's heavy involvement with establishing that form of government.
Okay. And when would you point to some of the startings of that? So you say it's modern, but it probably goes back a few hundred years at least.
Oh yeah, that's a great
Mm.
question. So I always locate the beginning of colonialism, modern colonialism, when people who we would now call European, they wouldn't have called themselves European because Europe did not exist as an entity, but people who we would now call European coming to parts of the world that they had not known in significant numbers and finding those new places hospitable for, that is hospitable in their own mind to forming a new way of life. So we would want to say probably around the 15th century, moving into the 16th century. That's when we want to say modern colonialism starts to take its root. And that's
Mm.
different from, say, some of the earlier explorations, Marco Polo and others, who went to places heretofore. Now, this is when we have communities forming of people
Mm.
from what we would call the old world, what we would call Europe, coming to what people have often called the new world.
Yeah, so it's immediately political using the word government right from the outset there. Um, what
And,
would you say?
and
Oh yeah.
now let me just say, in terms of, you said it's immediately political. If we think about the wider understanding of politics, kind of coming from Aristotle, the polis, the shaping of an entire society.
Hmm.
That's what we mean. Because I want your listeners to understand, we don't mean political in often the narrow senses that it's talked about in the world today, but that wider sense
Yeah, and that's
of.
something we've talked about in these other episodes is people sometimes have a hard time imagining how much, politics is a much bigger thing.
Mhm, mhm.
It's
That's
not
exactly
separate from things like religion and culture and economics. This is
right,
all kind of one big
right,
thing.
right, right.
So what would you say were the motivations for this for these what we would now call Europeans to go out and establish communities and start to govern elsewhere?
Well, I think you have three fundamental motivations. So the first is the motivation built on, let's use the word discovery. And often for your listeners, it's important to understand that when we use the word discovery, we're talking primarily about what these people we would call European understood as discovery, not what indigenous peoples or peoples native to the land would call discovery. They don't see themselves as being discovered. So we're using that term pretty
Mm,
precisely. So it's trying to make sense of the discovery, why it's here, what it's here for, what's the reason for it. And so trying to organize in their own mind and life how to make sense of a world opening up to them that they had heretofore not really grasped. So that's the first. The second are the unbelievable resources that are presented.
hmm.
The natural resources, gold, copper, silver, the incredible expanses of land, and then the people and all that they bring. All of these things energize greed. And we always want to keep greed as a second motivating factor. People imagining that they can claim something that heretofore they didn't imagine was there. And then the third thing that kind of was a driving force for it was in Christian theological language and in Christian theological vision, a sense of providence. That to be a Christian is to believe that God guides, God directs, God oversees. And so they imagine themselves having been brought there, led there by the divine hand of God and the providence of God. And so trying to understand and discern what God wanted them to do in these new places that God had led them to. And so those three factors, both at the level of emotion, at the level of cognition, at the level of action, all these factors, in a sense, are the engines driving what they will do when they come to the new worlds of Africa, the Americas, the Pacific Islands, Australia, all these places that they imagined God had led them to.
Okay, so discovery, that seems relatively innocent, although as you pointed out, it's a European-centered perspective because it's imagining us as the ones doing the discovering, and then
Right.
Greed.
So come back to just like to discovery.
Yeah.
So what I want you to capture is the kind of coping character of it. So
Oh, right.
what I always tell my students is think about if we ever find out that if we ever discover some fuel that will get us to another planet that's just like ours, and we discover people who in some ways are like us but different, and having to make sense of this new, both the exhilaration and the panic of now everything I've thought about in terms of who I am, or who I understand God to be, who I understand what the world to be, and now is thrown into chaos because there's new. And so it's discovery tied to kind of coping reality of the new, right? And then the second thing, greed,
Yeah.
which is really important. Greed is really important. And then the third thing was
This is interesting because you said the third thing was providence. I was expecting you to say mission. I was
no,
expecting you to say preaching the gospel and evangelizing everyone.
no, that comes a little later. I mean, not immediately later, but we have to understand the overarching thing is not the first people who come. And I always like to think of this in terms of three crucial agents: the merchants, the missionaries, and the soldiers. If you keep those agents in mind, it helps us understand the first thing for everyone, and then for just the ordinary people coming to build farms, what we later on call farms, haciendas, encomidas, plantations. The first thing is a sense of providence that God has opened this up for us. 10 years before, we didn't even know that this place existed, and all of a sudden, here we are. I mean, you have to keep in mind. Think about someone raised, somewhere in what we now call the UK, somewhere in the old world, somewhere in France, maybe what we now call France, and their world is, say, like a 30-mile circumference. That's basically their world. And all of a sudden, they are in what we will later call the mountains of West Virginia. And that stretches out for thousands of miles. 10 years ago, they didn't even know it existed. But here, it stretches out for thousands of miles. And now here's the thing we want to keep in mind. It's very important for your listeners to understand. And then something is whispering into their ears. God has given you all this.
That's a very attractive thing to hear someone to hear, right?
Absolutely. So we have to understand that when you say what's the engine, these are real engines, driving massive engines, driving forward people to risk life, limb, and everything to come to the new world.
So by the 15th century, there's something within what we now might call European Christianity that has already developed a vision of, you know, land as property, of, right, these kinds of, that kind of acquisitiveness, right, the roots of kind of modern capitalism are kind of well in the ground here. And so all of this is kind of, right, providence in the context of that, right, is what they're seeing. What would God want for us? God would want for us to have resources and money and, right, this kind of stuff. And so, and I think there's something really interesting there theologically for us to learn about, you know, belief in that, in God's providence, and the belief that we are following God's providence. Those things sometimes get conflated, and whatever we're doing, we say, God wanted me to do this.
Right.
And that's not always the case, right? There's something else that we're assuming about God that might be at odds there.
That is an incredibly important point. And I think the other element that drives it toward a sick end is that the Christians who came to the New World from the 15th century forward were bringing already a fairly diseased understanding of their own positionality. What do I mean by that? They understood themselves to have replaced Israel, to replace Jewish people as the people of God. So they were coming believing that God's plan for how God would restore the world, how God would save the world, was all on their shoulders. They were the people of God. And so they had moved Israel out of the way and saw themselves not only in the providence of God, but you're pointing toward this word, the plan of God. It's one thing to understand yourself to be in God's providence. Another thing to understand is to be in God's actual plan for getting things done. And
you're an agent.
That's the danger. The danger is when a people is formed, and inside that people's theology, and here we're talking about Christians, there is the sense that they embody the divine plan. Now, that nugget, that cancerous nugget, is at the heart of so much bad Christianity, as opposed to a Christianity that understands itself not as replacing Israel, but joining with another people to form a people. Bad nugget says, no, they're out the picture. God's working through us. And therefore, whatever we build has the divine will at stake. So what does that then mean? As nations form, as the idea of, because what also forms during these centuries of colonialism is the idea of a nation state tied to another crucial idea, which is territory. And so these ideas start to think of them as a really bad necklace that really problematic. So these ideas form together. And so, but what's holding them all together? What's holding them all together? People, nation, territory, governmentality. What's holding them all together is this idea that our people are the embodiment of the plan of God for the planet. And so once you have that horrible mix, the first people who feel the terrible effects of that are indigenous and native peoples, because what happens to them? They are not the subject of divine will. They're the object of divine will.
Yeah, that's where it all gets tricky, because when you initially described this, European suddenly seeing thousands of miles of land, I initially imagined all of that land as empty and unoccupied, and then it seemed to me, well, there's not much wrong with being given all of this. But actually, if there's people already there, that's when it gets tricky. How do you think about those people?
That's right. That's tricky. But what's also tricky is the idea that they believe that God gave them land, which that vision already has made land an object, made animals a tool, and made people tied inextricably to utility. And so when you bring a theology, a distorted theology that already has contorted the creation in that way, nothing but bad things will follow.
And how do you think that relates to, because if people, we're thinking about, we kind of have this Christians thinking of themselves as replacing Israel, but also
Mhm.
looking back to the Old Testament saying God gave Israel land. They use this kind of language.
Right,
What's different? What happens there when God gives Israel some land versus
right,
what they're thinking in the 15th century about God giving them land?
right. The first major difference is that there's nothing in the Old Testament, nothing in the Hebrew Bible that says this is transferable.
Right.
There's nothing that says that this is a mode of operation that will continue beyond Israel. And that's the first thing that the problem of replacement thinking did. It made all of Scripture, especially the Old Testament, transferable in a way that absolutely denied its moment in time, its uniqueness, and most importantly, our coming into another story. So that there is something to be thought through in relationship to Israel's conquest history. But the most important thing for us is the transferring of conquest logic into Christian nations who would
Mhm.
say, literally say, whether we're talking about the French or the Dutch or the British or the Germans or later on the Americans, they would literally say, just as God did with Israel this, so too we can do this with, and you name the place, Canada, parts of Canada, parts of what we call the United States, Haiti, Cuba, you name the place, Australia. It's the same tragic logic. And so that what we're finding is a form of Christianity that already has flipped things upside down, and now comes into the world with things utterly distorted. It's like people literally walking on their head, feet in the air. Everything is upside down.
Well, you've already brought in the role of Christianity quite strongly into this idea of modern colonialism. But I can imagine somebody saying, okay, that sounds really bad. It's a terrible shame that it happened, but it happened a long time ago, and it doesn't affect us now, right? I mean, I'm putting
Yeah,
that very
yeah.
bluntly.
Right.
What are the
It,
signs today? What do we live with today that's a consequence of that?
And even maybe adding on to that, Americans often think, well, England is a colonial power. We were a colony and we got our independence, and those people are colonists, and that's terrible of them. Right.
They're great questions. The thing that I think is always important for your listeners to remember is that there's this great passage in the Bible where it's in Psalms where it says, the lines of my life lay in beautiful places. That is, I'm
Mm,
following lines that have been laid in beautiful places. Well, we're following lines that were not laid in beautiful places. So let's name about 4 or 5 things that come to us from the lines that were laid in very bad places.
mhm,
The first is the way we look at land as property. And this already undermines for Christians a doctrine of creation, that many Christians walk around thinking that God created private property,
mhm,
that God created territory, and that people should be organized by who owns what territory. This is theologically deeply problematic because it denies the doctrine of creation. It denies the deep levels of connectivity. The second thing is that has come to us is that people should be organized as nations, and nations are tied to territory, who owns what. And so many Christians baptize this and say this is natural. When to be a Christian, to be a part of the body of Christ, challenges the very idea, the very configuration of our lives defined by nations. This
mhm,
is another line. Then let's take a third one that we haven't mentioned yet. It's the forming of people inside of the vision of race, when the colonialists understood land as private property, the way they were able to do that was to separate in their minds the deep connection of people to land. And by land, I'm including water and animals and birds and skies and season. How people not only identify with and identify through land, particular places, but also know themselves in a continuous way by their involvement with that place, how they know who they are because of the way they live near the water, near the stream, near this mountain, near these animals who are part of their family. And so what happens is that the separation of people from that means that identity becomes carried wholly on the body and tied primarily to description based on appearance, race. So that racial identity comes to stand in for, represent what land and place used to represent. That is, this is how I know who I am, number one, and how you know me and how I describe myself by this place. So one of the things you find out when you look at the journals of the missionaries and the merchants and the soldiers when they come to new places, when the colonialists came to a place and they meet people and they say, tell us who you are. People would often tell them stories. Say, okay, great story, but who are you? They would tell you long stories, or then they would give a name that makes no sense apart from that place. My name is Running Bear. I am daughter of the running stream. That's what my name means. And so the very way in which they are to be identified is tied to that. What the colonialists brought was a different way of identifying them. No, you are an Indian, and this land is for property. And this land is like, so I can move you from this land and send you someplace else because I want this land. And so that's the third thing, a form of identity that's disconnected from place, and people then living fundamentally disconnected from place. And then last but not least, what comes to us right now is a terrible, distorted vision of who we are as the people of God, rather than a people who have joined another people and thereby creating the trajectory, the way of life that always invites us to join others. We inherited a vision in which we replaced people and we became the center. And so to be Christian means you come to us. We are the host and you are the guest. You come to us and we will change you to be like us. And all of these things mean that Christians have had to struggle against ways of being that are diametrically opposed to our way of life. Now, there is good news. So let me come to the good news. The good news is that everything we've been talking about since we started today, there have always been Christians who have opposed all of this.
Yeah, that's right.
Always been. There's always been Christians, missionaries, others who have opposed everything. Now, the problem for us is that they were often kicked out of the denomination, excommunicated from the Catholic Church. If they were on the mission field, the term that we later on created, we'll call going native, was a part of the reality. They so identified with the people that they became a part of them and they struggled against them. And here's the problem for us. We often don't have their stories. We don't have their recorded records, their stories, their testimony, because in many cases, when they came back to the old world, they were destroyed, or they were excommunicated, and they were treated as though they did not exist. And from the very beginning, they've always been Christians who said, this is not the way to be Christian. The way to be Christian is to join other people. The way to be Christian is to not take their land, is to join them in the land. The way to be Christian is to resist the merchants and the soldiers' activities among them. The way to be Christian is not only to teach, but firstly, to learn. Christians who learn, who became so identified with the people that they became a part of the people. Now, what we need at this moment for so many young people especially, is we need scholars who will go back and unearth as much as possible those stories from the very beginning of colonialism, those stories of people who fought, who became Christian, but who fought. And we need the stories of those indigenous people, those native peoples who became Christian, but knew that this was not the right. Here's the amazing thing. They became Christian, but they realized that this isn't real Christianity. I'm a Christian and I learned a Christian from these people. I've learned Christian from the people coming to take my land and so forth. But this isn't real Christianity. So, for example, the long history of African American, African diaspora Christianity, of Africa, of former slaves and slaves who became Christian, but who said that's not the right Christian, right kind of Christianity. The number of what we now call Latinx Christians who also oppose colonialism. There's a famous one that been doing research on for a long time. His name is Guaman Puma Diala. He was a Peruvian Christian who wrote what I consider, well, many, not just me, but many people consider the first text of liberation theology in the 16th century. And he wrote it to he wrote it to the King of Spain, begging the King of Spain to get his priests and get his Christians in order because they were killing, robbing, pillaging, raping indigenous women. He wrote it was 1,500-page letter to the king. And he did so as a Christian. And that is the thing about it. We always have these people, but they're a minority report, often hidden.
Yeah, wow. I think that it's really important but also challenging because it's really easy to say, okay, those are the true Christians. The other ones weren't. Let's ignore them. I identify with the good ones. How do we navigate this sense of what does it mean for our identity as Christians today that such a kind of majority report of Christians in this era were on the wrong side of this? And then we had these Christians who saw it for what it was, but their voices were kind of submerged. How do we handle that well, beyond just kind of seeking out their stories in order to let ourselves off the hook?
Right. So what we have to understand is that we are yet living inside the bad trajectories of a Christianity born of colonialism. We're still living inside of it. And so by simply saying we identify with the good ones is just a waste of voice. We are identifying by our actions with the trajectory that has harmed so many. And so the first thing we have to do is to check out how we can change those trajectories, how we change how we understand living in the land, how we change how we think about reparations, and especially in terms of indigenous peoples, how we think about our existence as Christians inside of nations and following the logics of race. We are, until we challenge these things, we are yet inside the same trajectories. And so that means there's some options. As I always say, it's not a question of whether one is a good Christian or a bad Christian. It's a question of what kind of witness as a Christian will you give now that you know these trajectories? That's the question. What kind of witness will you give? And will your witness simply say, I am fine with continuing to function in the logics of nation states and their territorial ways of understanding statecraft. I am fine with continuing to look at the world as private property, get as much as you can, and who cares about indigenous peoples? They lost, too bad. I am fine with treating the world as a bunch of resource that I extract from. I am fine with walking around and thinking about myself inside of racial logics and functioning inside of them. I'm fine with all that, and yet I still worship Jesus. That's a problem, because everything about the gospel presses against all the things that you're fine with. And so to me, that's the opportunity. And the good news is there are, as you both know, there are many people around the world. I often talk to a lot of indigenous Christians, and there are many who are trying right now to rethink their Christianity. They're not walking away from Christianity, though some are really struggling with it. But many are saying, okay, we're Christian. We love and we follow Jesus. We believe that he is God incarnate and that we have been joined through the Spirit to many who follow. Now, what does that look like given the way Christianity has helped to shape the world? Now, let me just say this, because I think it's always important for people to understand. Think of Christianity's past as setting up as a kind of parent, setting up some pretty bad behavior from its children. And
A bad
think of,
parent. Okay.
yeah, so think of Christianity as having helped to give birth to the modern nation state, having helped to give birth to racial vision, having helped to give birth to an idea of private property and territoriality, having given birth to a form of aggressive governmentality that presses upon people ways of life that they may not want, but we say is good for them. So Christianity helped to give birth to all that. But the point is that Christianity, from the very beginning, has also given birth to those who opposed each of those things. And so we have to recognize that, this is in many ways, it is a kind of family squabble, kind of family argument. Even, I would say, even people who have nothing to do with Christianity, who don't think Christianity, they've never been Christian, they call themselves secular, but they operate in all these categories born of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And so even with them, I tell them, you may not be a Christian, but there is something at stake for you in a form of Christianity that will challenge the problems that you see at the level of the nation state, at the level of government, at the level of corporation, at the level of the way we treat the environment. There's something at stake for you in a Christianity that challenges that. Because whether you like it or not, you are operating in a certain kind of distorted mode of Christian thought and practice, even as you consider yourself nothing but a secularist.
And sometimes I think one of the things that I struggle with, kind of, if we think of secularism broadly, is when people think of secularism as a kind of neutral state, then it's hard for them to see these things built into it as well. And that kind of historical connection with these kind of lines of thinking. And so I often, I think similarly, it's kind of like, whether or not you're interested in religion, thinking well about theology and religion helps you unearth these categories within a kind of otherwise, theoretically secular worldview that people hold.
I think that's true. And we know that most young people who get an education at any fine liberal arts institution, or even one that's not, they will often be told a kind of strange Enlightenment story that there was this absolute break mm-hmm. from religion and Christianity. When in point of fact, you can't really break from your mama. I mean, and because they look like you look like them, you talk like them, you act like them, and they are inside of practices that are born of Christianity. I mean, the modern university is built out of the monastic gestures. And so, I always try to help people understand that I'm not asking you to accept Christianity. I'm certainly not arguing for a new form of Christendom. All I'm saying is that in order to address problems that now reach far beyond Christianity, you have to understand that those trajectories are born inside of a bad form. And that, in point of fact, to address them, you're probably going to have to come close to a kind of Christian practice. Or if you want to say more broadly, kind of religious practice in order to address them. So the very, let's just take the one basic idea that everybody has some sense of. We all know that a reality of individualism can only go so far before it becomes utterly diseased, and that there has to be a sense of the shared and of solidarity. if we're going to survive. And so whether you're a secularist or not, at some point in time, if you want to survive, let's use the analogy, it's a boat. And so you're going to have to act like it's a boat, which means, how you step, where you step, all of us are at stake. We will all drown if you don't realize
We're
that
all
you're
in
on a
this
boat.
together.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I think that in and of itself requires a movement. Now, of course, we know that there are some secular traditions that already believe in the shared, which is fine. And I think that's wonderful. I just think that it's always cute when you watch people articulate that. Boy, it sounds very theological.
Yeah, for sure.
Sounds very theological.
I mean, it's great to hear that there's definitely these two strands all the way through Christian history. There's the report of the sort of diseased lines and trajectories of colonialism, but there's also the people who always opposed it. But I think I still struggle with this idea. If all of these bad trajectories that we're on are born of Christianity, how can how can we avoid the implication that there's something essentially wrong with Christianity if it could give birth to those things? Do you see what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah, yeah. And we can't because of the way in which it has come to us. There's an inescapable critique. There's an inescapable accusation that's launched at Christianity that we have to accept. Why? Because what's also inherent to Christianity and being a Christian is the recognition of sin.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to accept that there is a proper accusation that must always be aimed at us because we fail. But failing is the human condition apart from life with God. And
Mm-hmm.
failing is a human condition even when we try to follow God, that there is still the reality of failure. And so what we don't want to do is to say, if someone says that there's something inherently problematic in Christianity, the answer is yes, it's called Christians. There's something inherently problematic. We often fail, and we often fail badly, because this is a part of the logic of following after a God that we have not caught up with yet. But if that means that the following of God is a hoax, if that means to someone that Christianity itself is so flawed that it's a waste of time, then they've gone too far. They've missed the point. The point is that what these Christians from the very beginning experienced is exactly what we experience. That is the fear of the unknown and responding poorly to it, greed and responding poorly to it, power and responding poorly to it, having a God speak to you and respond poorly to listening to that God. These are all parts of the human condition. And those things are yet with us. And so, I do think what Christianity offers is both a recognition of what human failing is and what it can do, but also what it might mean to overcome as a daily practice those failings. And so, this is where, especially for young people, as they look out in their world, I always say to them, the challenge for you is discovering a way of life that will allow you not to do what the colonialists have done.
Mm-hmm.
And I have found that I need God's help for that. And the good news is that before I even asked for God's help, God offered it and continues to offer it. So Christianity, we can say about Christianity something similar to what many wise people in the past said about democracy. What do they say about democracy? Democracy, from the very beginning, has been an experiment. Democracy is one big sentence. Let's try this out and see if it works. So Christianity, we don't want to say it's an experiment in that sense. What we do want to say is that Christianity, what we believe it is God, having drawn us into God's life, is willing to yet risk with us life together. God is risking, and we are risking with one another. That's what Christianity at its heart is God having become one with us and living in the risk. And so what does that mean then? It means it's what you mentioned earlier, the accusation that can be brought against Christians is an accusation that can also be brought against God. If this is the God who these people follow, I don't have anything to do with that God. But that's a part of the risk.
Well, you'd hope that that accusation is not accurate then.
Pardon?
Well, you'd hope that that accusation, at least against God, doesn't hold water. Yeah.
Well, here's the thing we want to remember. God has never been surprised over accusation.
Mm-hmm.
and God has never been overcome by accusation. In fact, we know that the God we serve, from the moment that God became flesh through the moment that God rose from the dead, that God was surrounded by accusation. So
Fair enough.
accusation is not the problem. I think the problem for us is hoping to win in such a way that we present ourselves always as triumphant, and that will never happen.
Mm-hmm.
That will never happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's so insightful because that is the, this, I mean, like where we started, this idea that I embody God's plans is this is a forgetfulness of the heart of the Christian belief that I am fallen, that I am sinful, that God does his plans, if through me, often despite me, because of his grace, not because I'm going to pull all this off. And if I'm successful, I can say, therefore, that was what God wanted.
Right.
And so to look back in our history with a different lens than that is silly, right? As Christians, I think to be able to look back and say, and this is what you often get is, Christians really like to look back and say, oh, Christianity gave the West, ethics and, we care about the value of life and all this. And then, critics want to say, well, it gave us colonialism and racism. And we should be able to say all of those things come from people. And that's not surprising to us, right? And so as Christians, why can't we handle that? And I think it's kind of telling that, even on a personal level, we probably struggle to handle that if we can't handle it on a historical level either. So there's a lot of wisdom to be gained from just looking at the history as it is, and really seeing it for what it is.
That's a very wise statement. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And the goal, especially when we're talking to young people, because I spend a lot of time talking to young people, is to remind them that a life lived well is never a life lived perfectly. It's a life lived with a witness that's always aimed toward the good. And for the Christian, it's a witness of always straining to discern what God is saying. And it's the struggle, the straining to discern what God is saying. That is the whole point. That is the whole point. Sometimes we heard right, sometimes we heard wrong, and sometimes we heard right, but you just didn't want to do it.
Well, it certainly sounds challenging what you're saying, trying to how to respond to these bad trajectories that we're on, trying to go against the grain of things like private property and the nation state is challenging and could be costly.
As they say, that's beautifully understated.
Well, I'm British. I love understatement.
It's beautifully understated because it will be costly. And for all of us who claim to be followers of Jesus, we struggle with his words. What you just said brings to mind the famous passages in the gospel where he says, if you wish to follow me and hate not mother, father, sister, brother,
Mm-hmm.
even your own life, you cannot follow me. You must take up your cross and follow me. And then that famous text in Galatians, we attribute to Paul, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but the life I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and died for me. I mean, these are, as I say, these are weighty words. These are weighty words. And so
Yeah.
and none of us, unless you masochists or, none of us run to, none of us run to this, but we cannot avoid it. We cannot avoid the fact, as I always tell my students, if people understood, if people understood that at heart, you as a Christian are a traitor to almost everything they hold dear, to their love of nation, their love of family, their love of their community, that you are a traitor to all that because you are bound to another group, you'd be in serious trouble. But we often hide the truth of who we are, that we are bound to the body of Jesus, and that makes us unreliable for any other allegiance.
And
And of
dangerous for
course,
any other politics. Yeah.
exactly right. But of course, we have proven ourselves to be just the opposite very often. But at heart, that's what's there. It's the it's so much a part of the call that Jesus makes to his disciples, right? They leave ways of life. Sons of Zebedee, leave your father and come. Matthew, leave the table and come. I mean, these are weighty matters. And so I always say to young people, especially, don't simply look at the history of Christianity, its good and its bad. Look, but listen and see if you can discern the struggle that all those people have been inside of trying and failing and yet trying to follow God.